Good morning to everybody. My name is Jared, and I'm from the LRF Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk at National University of Singapore. So today it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Youth in Action, Taking on Climate Change Action Workshop. We've got an exciting program lined up for everybody here, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome our director, Prof. Koh Changi, to give us his welcome remarks. Prof. Koh, please.
Thank you, Jared. Dear participants, good morning and a very warm welcome to this workshop on Youth in Action, Taking on Climate Change. As you heard from Jared already, this is organized by the LRF Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk on the day just before the World Environment Day, which is tomorrow, in case you're not aware. Okay, I'm the director of Institute. My name is Changi, and at the Institute, we conduct research, education, and outreach on risk perception and risk communication, with an aim to help people better understand and communicate risks, including climate change risk, which is the theme of this workshop today. A lot of people are concerned about the impact of climate change, particularly the younger generation, and rightly so. I know many young people have the passion in wanting to do more for the environment and fight climate change. Some of you are here indeed for this reason. Our institute has in fact been working closely with young people through our programs for students, researchers, and interns, as well as public engagement events like this workshop. We have recently organized a data visualization competition specifically for young people on climate risk communication. And you can see the program later. We are going to see a short video on the winning proposals. And in the panel discussion, which is going to start right after my introduction, you will hear from 4 speakers. Thanks to them, they are here to share their views and actions on tackling climate change. You also hear after that from our lead scientist for environment and climate, Dr. Oliver Jensen, who will talk about our efforts on climate action. So I hope you have a rewarding time in the next 1.5 hours. Thank you. Yeah, back to you, Jared.
Jared, you're muted.
Thanks, Leonard. Thank you, Prof. Koh, for the welcome speech. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the time to Prof. Leonard Lee, who will be chairing the panel, and he's also our Deputy Director of the Institute. Prof. Lee, please.
Thank you so much, Jared. Thank you, Changi. Good morning to everyone who is able to join us this morning. So I'm pretty sure that all of you would agree with me that the youth of today represent a major force in our ongoing battle against climate change and also our endeavor to achieve environmental sustainability. This morning, we are truly honored to have 4 very distinguished panelists with us. So each of them has a breadth of experience on the topic of climate change, and as you can see, as you will see, in very different capacities. So in this segment of the program, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first invite each of the 4 panelists to share their perspectives on climate change and their experience working on this issue with you. Right. So after that, we're going to devote as much time as possible to addressing any questions that you, the audience, might have. So please feel free to leave any questions that you might have for the speakers in the chat window. So we actually only have about 55 minutes for this session. So it is inevitable that we will not be able to get to all of your questions. However, we'll do our best to consolidate these questions and forward them to the respective speakers after the session. Right. Okay, so let me begin by first introducing our very first speaker. So this morning we have Latika Muli. You might be interested to know that her background is in electrical engineering. So she's a graduate from NYU, and she works on commercializing clean tech solutions. But importantly, she's truly passionate and dedicated to the youth engagement for the Sustainable Development Goals. And what she is doing is she's hoping to provide a platform to actually develop solutions for climate action. And she works together with various individuals, nonprofits, as well as industry experts. So let me turn the floor over to Lathika. So Lathika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leonard. Can you all hear me okay? Is the audio
Very well, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the team at NUS for hosting this. And thank you to the audience for being here. It's really encouraging to see that there are so many youth that are interested in learning about climate action and seeing what they can do to contribute to the fight against climate change. So maybe over the next 5 minutes, what I can just quickly do is I will share a bit on how I got started, what my reflections have been in climate action, and just a few key takeaways and lessons that I keep with me in my own journey moving forward that I hope may be helpful to you as well. So I ended up in the world of climate action. It was quite a serendipity, in all honesty. So as Prof. Leonard mentioned, I am an electrical engineer, but I was never the greatest engineer, if I can put it mildly. My interest in technology has always been from a people's perspective. So, how are people interacting with technology? What is the impact of technology on social and environmental relationships? So it was always more geared towards, how can we make things more user-friendly? How can we make sure that people really understand the technologies that they're using? After graduation from my bachelor's, actually, I completed my bachelor's at NYU, but NYU's campus in Shanghai. So I was based in China for about 4 years. And at that time, even now, China's renewable energy industry is obviously booming. And I realized that, as part of my interest in technology and society, I want to take a look at the renewable energy industry. This was more from the perspective of, I want to learn more. And this was, 4 or 5 years ago, before climate action had gained the kind of momentum the way it has today. At that time, I joined a small startup in Shanghai where I was looking at business development. I was looking at, how can we use digital technologies to accelerate the energy transition. So looking at artificial intelligence, looking at blockchain, looking at IoT, and so on. I think, like I mentioned, it was more from the perspective of me wanting to learn. And it was more from the perspective of wanting to know what the challenges in the energy transition are. From that, I ended up actually participating in a program by UN Environment, which was focused on giving startups a platform to raise funding. And I think that's actually where I learned about the importance of jobs such as the one that I was having, and the importance of startups and youth in climate action. Prior to that, I was very much focused on the fact that I knew I was doing good. I knew I was working in a renewable energy firm, which is great, but I had never really thought about the broader concept of what that means in the big picture. And why is renewable energy important in an existential form? So not just as an industry, but what does it mean for our future? So when I joined that UN Environment program, I actually met a range of startups that were working in a lot of issues, from ocean plastic pollution to air pollution to the issue of sustainable cooling and so on. And we essentially went through like a 1-week boot camp with UN Environment, where we learned about the breadth of various environmental issues that we're facing in different parts of the world. And that's when I realized I had this this light bulb moment where I was like, oh, damn, I have been working in, excuse my language, but it was really a light bulb moment where I was like, wow, I've been working in the space without actually realizing the importance of it. And, obviously there's a commercial importance of it. There's the importance of it from renewable energy, but knowing what it means for someone as a youth who is worried about the future of climate change, it didn't strike me until that moment, the importance of entrepreneurs, the importance of innovators in being able to actually make change. So that's when I realized that this is the field that I resonate the most with. This is the field that I want to dedicate my life to. And that this is truly where I feel not just fulfilled, but where I feel that this is an area where I can make a difference, not just in my job, not just in other people's life, but on a whole. So that's where that actually kickstarted my journey in climate action. It was because of that one program that I'm forever indebted to. Following that, I also realized that when you work in the climate action space, there's obviously a lot of issues, whether it be the fact that things are moving, maybe perhaps not fast enough for us to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, whether it's the fact that, a lot of countries still haven't banned plastic and so on. So it can often be a discouraging field to work in, but I realized that when I was working with a lot of startups in this field, what really gets us moving is knowing that there are other people out there fighting the good fight. So there were a few key takeaways that I learned just from that 1 week. In addition to all of that, I had learned about environmental issues. So I think one was that, people in the climate action space motivate each other. And it can be quite discouraging when you're working with big corporations, when you're working with governments that may not move as fast as you'd like them to. And that's where we need other climate warriors to be there for each other and to keep ourselves motivated. The second was I realized that, it will take a lot of time for the kind of scale we need to actually tackle climate change. The kind of solutions that we have for them to hit that kind of critical mass where they can really make a difference in emissions, in footprint, in waste resources, and so on. It will take some time. What we really need to do is we need to realize as individuals, what do we want out of it? Whether it's a job that makes you feel fulfilled, whether it's something that you want to look at from engaging youth, and so on. What I realized was that for me, it can be quite frustrating to see that there are so many issues in the environmental space along the value chain and so on. But what I really want is I want to know that every day I am trying my best for the environment and for sustainability. For me, that's more than sufficient. And the two things that I can control is where I spend my time and where I spend my money. And that's where I decided that, there are so many issues out there to solve. But what I can do is I can use my time, which includes my job and my time beyond my job, to actually help the climate space. So that's where I made that decision point where I want to work in jobs that have some sort of positive contribution to the environment, whether that's within the department of a company that is focusing on sustainability, or whether that's a sustainable firm that's helping other firms, decarbonize and so on. Beyond that, I realized that I also want to use my time after work to give people the same opportunities that I've been lucky enough to have. That kind of education that can give you that light bulb moment on how can I break into the space? What can I do to really make this kind of contribution and so on? That's when I wanted to volunteer. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to see what initiatives are out there that I could add value to with the skill sets that I have. And that's actually how I ended up realizing that there is so much more to climate action and to environment than we can ever know. It's a huge space. There are so many different things to learn. It's really a journey. It's not a sprint towards a destination, right? Every day you learn something new that you didn't know before. And I think the way that I ended up breaking into the space, or the way that I ended up putting my thoughts into actions, is really through volunteering. I initially started volunteering through an organization called Unleash, which is, you may see from my Zoom background here. So what Unleash does is they bring together a network of 1,000 youth every year to one location to solve for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I was lucky enough to participate in the conference in 2019, which was unfortunately the last one before COVID hit. And it was over there that I realized also that it's so important to give youth this platform where they can learn more, just the way that I had done a few years ago. So I continued my volunteering with Unleash, and I am currently the ambassador in Singapore, where I help them host a lot of events where youth in our community within ASEAN can learn from each other, can learn from industry experts. So I think that's where I feel like if I am giving it my best, I am working in a green job. In my day job, I work as a sustainability solutions analyst at NG Impact, where I work with clients to decarbonize them, help them meet their RE100 targets and net zero targets. So I've been lucky enough to find a company and a job that drives and accelerates my goals towards contributing to sustainable development. But I'm also lucky enough to have that kind of time and to have the kind of resources that I've developed through networking, through volunteering, to have an impact on society beyond my my 9-to-5 kind of job, I guess. So I guess those are a few reflections on my journey. And I do hope that, anyone who has questions, please feel free to ask. Yeah, back to you, Prof. Leonard.
Lathika, thank you so much for sharing that, truly inspiring journey. And so I think, as you were talking, I was thinking that even though this big issue of climate change, seems so beyond our control, but there are also many things that are actually within our control, right? That specific actions that we can take in our everyday lives, or through volunteering, or one way or the other. And so one of the things that you mentioned is these emerging group of climate warriors, which I really like that term. And in fact, our next speaker is truly a climate warrior himself, right? So I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, RJ Nair. So RJ is currently a student in law as well as liberal arts with NUS Law as well as Yale NUS. So RJ volunteers with the SG Climate Rally, or short for SGCR, right? And SGCR, or SG Climate Rally, organized Singapore's first climate rally in 2019, just before the pandemic, right? So if you're not familiar with SGCR, so what SGCR aims to do is to bring about a just and necessary transition to a net zero Singapore in 2050 by mobilizing broad support from the public policymakers and businesses. So to tell us more about his volunteering experience, as well as his perspectives on the topic of climate change, let's welcome RJ Nair.
Thank you, Leonard, for that introduction. And thank you to the organizers of this event and my fellow panelists as well for inviting us to speak and joining me in this discussion. My name is RJ. I help out and I volunteer with SG Climate Rally. Given that our engagement will be brief, only 55 minutes or so, as you've heard, I'll present briefly on one topic that is the focus of SG Climate Rally, and this is the topic of climate justice. SG Climate Rally calls for climate justice, which is different in its focus from just addressing the climate crisis, which is the prevailing statement. So 3 things I'll talk about with regards to climate justice. Firstly, what it is. Secondly, why it matters. And thirdly, how it can be achieved. So firstly, what it is. It's a well-known fact that the climate crisis is already creating many horrible impacts around the globe, be it drought, extreme weather events, or disease incidents. And these impacts disproportionately affect low-income, indigenous, and rural inhabitants in areas such as the Global South. Furthermore, the transition to a green economy, while having huge potential, also has risks for many low-income workers employed in sectors that depend on, in one way or another, on fossil fuels. Climate justice starts from the belief that our transition to a green society must necessarily be accompanied by social programs and reforms that promote the interests of these marginalized groups. So the second issue on why it matters. It can be argued that justice and social justice, while important, is not as pressing of an issue as the climate crisis, right? Which is a very urgent problem that potentially is catastrophic for human civilization. This argument is well-intentioned. However, it fails to appreciate that the systems which produce the climate crisis are the same ones that perpetuate global and local injustices and inequality. How do I arrive at this conclusion? The climate crisis, though of catastrophic proportions, is not being adequately dealt with by government and corporations around the world. Why is this so? This is because the incentives that motivate corporate leaders and corporate influence governments, which is most of them, are short-term and inadequate to account for sustaining our world and our civilization. These same systems, which are inherently undemocratic, fail to meet the needs of less privileged people who do not necessarily have the ear of their governments. Thank you. The same mining practices that harm the earth also harm the miners. The same large plantations that endlessly pursue deforestation also displace rural and indigenous farmers. The same governments that strip environmental protections also promote the reopening of business life during a deadly global pandemic. So this brings me to the last limb, which is how it can be achieved. As I mentioned, corporate and government incentives where they currently stand are inadequate to deal with the climate crisis and the urgency it requires. This is why the change to the system has to come from public pressure on governments to regulate corporations through engaging with policymakers or replacing them at elections if they fail to do so. To get public pressure and support, packages that deal with the climate crisis must also deal with issues that the public is concerned about. Inequality, public health, and opportunities, issues which are as important. And this is why climate and justice are two halves of the same coin. Tackling climate change needs public pressure, and public pressure and support can be galvanized only by addressing the injustices that the public faces in status quo. And this is not to say our individual actions are not important. They are. But ultimately, we cannot rely on scattered individual actions or corporate benevolence or tech magic that hasn't yet materialized. Collective action and public support to pursue climate just solutions is how we can ameliorate the climate crisis. To borrow a phrase used by the previous speaker, and thank you, everyone must become a climate warrior and form a climate army to take back power. How do we do this? Go to your representatives, participate in the electoral process. Talk about climate issues at the workplace, in your community, in your electoral district or GRC, with a view to supporting people who care about the climate crisis gain positions of power and influence. Ultimately, although the climate crisis is a huge and super wicked problem, it is one that can be solved only through collective action by everyone in society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, RJ. So I think your comments, really highlighted the important fact that, climate change, environmental sustainability, these are issues that are very multifaceted, right? So, and they are issues that really require everyone to come together, to cooperate in a very synergistic way, whether it's the public, policymakers or industry players. As we have heard earlier from Lafika, this is truly more of a marathon or a long journey, rather than just a sprint. And someone who actually started relatively early, on this journey is our next speaker, Melissa Lowe. And Melissa currently is a graduate student at the Department of Geography at NUS, but she's also a research fellow at the Energy Studies Institute. Right. So when I mentioned that she started relatively early, I should also highlight the fact that she has participated in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties for more than a decade. Right. And I can't think of a better, a stronger sort of thought leader in this area. She has authored and presented her work at a number of different forums. And she currently also is the designated contact point for NUS's accreditation to the UNFCCC, which I mentioned earlier. And she serves on the 9-member steering committee of the Research and Independent Non-Governmental Organization constituency under UNFCCC. So to tell us more about this incredible journey that she has had, let's turn the floor over to Melissa.
Thank you, Leonard. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday morning. It's wonderful to see so many of you on this call. I'd just like to say thank you to the LRF Institute for the public understanding of risk, for organizing this talk, and looking forward to some of the exciting work that you're doing as well, especially on the fund announcement later. I won't give too much away, but so when I was invited to give this sharing, I was asked to think about my motivations and journey in climate action. And as Leonard pointed out, I started this journey more than 10 years ago. I was given the opportunity as a youth in my 3rd year of university. I was also at the NUS Geography Department as an undergraduate. And I was given the opportunity to participate in a competition to attend the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was the big COP15, Copenhagen, if some of you may remember, right? So it's 2009. The world was going to solve climate change in 2009, right? So I had the opportunity to participate in this competition. I had to write an essay, go through several rounds of debate. And when we finally got word that 12 of us were selected, it was funny because it's a competition, right? You would imagine there would be funding to attend. No, we had to get our own funding. We had to, if you won the competition, but then you still had to raise your own funds to go, right? And Copenhagen is not a cheap place to go, right? To attend a conference. So what we did was our group from, so this competition was organized by Eco Singapore, and we fundraised. Of course, we went, my parents actually had to sponsor my air ticket because the funds raised was just not enough even. So it was a 2-week conference. We went there and we rented a house. A nice couple had gone away for the winter and they rented us their house. This was pre-Airbnb, right? And 12 of us from Singapore slept in the attic and we sublet the house. Don't know if it was, so we're supposed to do that, but we sublet the house to another like 20, I think, Asian people, just so that we can cover the cost. So you imagine the kind of effort that we took, right? It was about a 45-minute journey to the conference venue every single day in the freezing cold. So this sort of like the sort of resilience that we had to undergo to attend this conference, and keeping in mind that very few people 10 years ago knew about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that experience for me, not knowing what to do, not being prepared, going there, inspired me to start my own form of capacity building, right? So the last 10 years at the Energy Studies Institute has actually been trying to build up a body of knowledge, a group of young advocates, advocates for climate action, and to help people here understand what's happening at the international negotiations. Is that, as many of you might know, it's just too complicated. Now it's become too nebulous. There's mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, capacity building, technology, a whole gamut of things, right? And actually right now, as we speak, the mid-year conference is ongoing, and because we can't meet in person, it's over 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks, and the time zone management is very challenging, as you can imagine. So the last 10 years has really been, for me, I've worked with so many partners, and I'm very grateful for NUS's support, of course, in allowing all of the workshops to happen. What I've realized is that there are many ways to advocate for climate action, and I'm so inspired by Ajay and Navika because I think they've approached this in a slightly different way from how those of my vintage, I think, and before have approached climate action. I think for some of us, for myself at least, I think I have tended to self-censor, if you will, right? Sometimes I try not to criticize too much because I keeping in mind that I'm also in research. My funding comes from certain places, right? So I'll be very honest with you, sometimes the policy briefs that we write, we have to be extremely balanced so that we don't over criticize. But I think this is the approach that's being taken by younger people today is very different. In fact, I sometimes joke with my colleagues at my age range that the younger group makes us look more moderate than we actually are, right? So they're slightly more left than us, and it's not a bad thing. I see it as an evolution of climate advocacy, and I enjoy seeing the approaches. Sometimes I participate as well. I was at the climate rally actually, and was enjoying myself at the back. So to me, it speaks to a development process, right, in Singapore. I think we've seen climate advocacy and action evolve tremendously in the last 10 years. We are in a much better place than before. I see policymakers being a lot more open to views and feedback, and I think that they're ready to engage. So researchers like myself, I think we are also pressed because views can be read and downloaded from all over the internet now. I myself sometimes feel that a bit becoming irrelevant because the things that I'm putting out, stuff is already online, so what more value can researchers like myself add? So I thought to add that point in because it might be relevant for some young people who are looking to go into academia and or policy making. So I think it's challenging. We have to figure out for ourselves what it's important to write, it's important to people to hear, and that in itself takes some skill, I would say. So I will leave it as that, and I look forward to the robust discussion later. Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That is a truly optimistic outlook. So at this juncture, let me also just remind everyone, if you have any questions for any of the four speakers, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat window, and we will try to get to as many of these questions as possible after our panelists have each spoken, right? Okay, so Melissa earlier mentioned a lot about policy making, and so when it comes to policy, so truly I cannot think of a better person than our fourth speaker, Professor Benjamin Carshaw, right, who has done a tremendous amount of work in this area and who is truly an authority in this area. Right, so Professor Carshaw is the professor in public management at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS. And before joining NUS and moving to Singapore last year, he actually spent almost 20 years at Yale. So Professor Carshaw specializes in global and multi-level environmental governance, comparative public policy and administration, and transnational business regulation, corporate social responsibility. But in particular, his substantive interests include climate policy, biodiversity conservation, land use change, sustainable environmental management of forests, and related agricultural sectors. So with that, let us invite Professor Carshaw to share with us his perspectives on climate change.
Thank you, Leonard, and really an honor to be part of this really important panel, because of course, the youth and youth movements are such an important part of environmental policy making over the last 30, 40 years. I want to give you a couple of thoughts about my own background and why I came to these questions, and then some observations about how to take these movements and make them catalytic in some way, given the crisis that we're facing. So my own background is quite fascinating. I actually, when I myself was a youth, was very much involved in these kinds of movements and political parties, both with respect to at the time in the 80s, the anti-nuclear weapons movement that spanned the world, and then also in the environment. And I began my own efforts both in terms of the old growth forestry challenges that were so important facing the planet, and got involved in political parties. I worked for the leader of the Canadian New Democratic Party in these issues. My father was the Minister of the Environment in British Columbia, Canada. There's lots of old growth trees. And I got involved in really important ways that now the other speakers on this panel are engaging in. But what happened to me was, in the middle of this, I recognized that, well, really important, I was really curious about the policy-making process. How do we move from ideas and people getting concerned about the environment to actually causing effective and durable policy change? And the durability question became really key to me, because when you look at environmental policy historically, both globally and domestically, a lot of the policy changes were temporary in nature. They reverted back to the previous equilibrium when a new government got elected, or they focused on other problems that were equally important but not of the environment. And so I worked a lot on thinking about how to create durable environmental policies, and in that respect, I've spent a lot of time on the issue of climate policy, which we refer to with my colleagues as a super wicked problem, I think was already mentioned. And now that's an important segue into then what I think we might want to ponder about how to take all this fantastic interest, especially in the part of the youth, and make it be transformed into durable policy solutions. As you all know, the last 30 years of climate policy have been highlighted by commitments that governments, the private sector, and individuals have made to address the climate crisis. And the vast majority of those commitments have not come to fruition. Okay? And so they revised and made new commitments further down into the future. And so this tendency to put off action into the future is one of the 4 key features of our super liquid problems framework, right? But another key feature is that the battle we're having isn't just with others, it's with ourselves. So we are simultaneously concerned about the climate crisis, and yet we act in ways that are inconsistent with that behavior, right? So how do we handle the fact that, unlike other movements, the movement isn't just facing other oppressors, but in fact is part of the problem itself? This is a real conundrum for us, but it also opens a space for thoughtful deliberation about how do we actually think about tending to our long-term environmental interests. So with a few minutes remaining, I want to give some thoughts on this, okay? I'm going to be a little bit provocative because I think that's important that we get that provocative thinking from the youth, right? And how to move forward and advance. But I want to argue that when we talk about transformative change and the lessons learned about how to be catalytic with these movements that are now emerging, and by the way, 20 years ago at Yale, nobody at that time was actually out there protesting. It was a very weak movement at that time, and now it's a very strong movement that the youth have really been part of catalyzing. So that's an incredible, really important political process. But how do we move from movements to impact? I think requires a few important steps of deliberation. And so one is, what do we mean by transformative change? What do we mean by this? Now, the world now talks about this as meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. We've heard this in the panel already today. And they're a really important set of goals around really important policy problems. But they don't all work in the same direction, right? They're oftentimes inverse with each other. And so some goals, for example, poverty alleviation, the world's done very well on, but on the environment, not so well, right? So do we mean that transformative change means keeping to the 1.5 degree Paris agreement? Is that what it means? Because if that's what it means, we got to work backwards based on that outcome and say, what do we need to do to achieve that outcome, even if it means perhaps undermining other goals, right? So how do we think about then these trade-offs in ways that might be important? Because climate goals have generally been compromised away in sustainable development conversation. So how do we not do that if we care about the 1.5 degree goal? And then secondly, my half minute remaining, how do we become catalytic? I would argue means doing more than simply having a movement around a specific tool, whether it be divestiture campaigns at universities, whether it be eco-labeling that I work on, or whether it be ESG efforts. And instead, discuss more carefully about what are the logics that might actually shape a 1.5 degree future, or maybe a 4 degree future, right? And this requires then much more thoughtful conversations around what we call fit for purpose policy design. And so how do we link this technocratic policy design stuff that can be a little bit like dry, maybe even boring, to create durable outcomes that can therefore take the social movements and what the youth are doing and make them more permanent? To me, is a really important question. And these two universes aren't really talking to each other, right? And how do we have the conversation to achieve luckily what we already want? Fit for purpose policy design to decarbonize and achieve the Paris Accord commitments. The youth have been so important in helping raise attention to. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. So thank you, Professor Kashaw, for the really thought-provoking and comments. Yeah, so I think your comments really highlighted the complexity in policy making, right? So it's about how, I mean, it's not just about turning some of the actions into policies, but truly transformative and durable policies, right? So there are lots of challenges that we have to face, whether it's procrastination or trying to reconcile between the self and what we want for the society. So lots and lots of issues. But based on all the discussions that we have had this morning, I think there is clearly hope and excitement in the space. And so I think let's all do our part, to on this continued fight against climate change. And so on that note, we have a few questions from the audience, and so take a quick look. Okay, so let's start with this particular question. Right. So what are some of the challenges? So this is a question for all the speakers. So what are some of the challenges that you have faced in getting to where you are today, in particular with respect to this climate change or environmental sustainability space? So would someone like to comment on these questions? What are some of the challenges that you have faced? Latika? Yeah, thank
sure.
you.
Maybe
That's
I can
great.
start off.
Yeah.
I think the challenges that I've faced have been different in the roles that I've served. So for example, like I mentioned, I'd started off working at a startup in the green space. And I think the challenge there was particularly in very legacy industries such as energy. It's very difficult to convince corporations, who to adopt solutions and to prioritize sustainability over short-term profits. So I think from an entrepreneur's perspective, that is the key challenge. From an individual perspective, I think it's been a few other things. One is, of course, it's always a difference between, do you want a job that pays you a lot or do you want a job that makes a difference? Sometimes that bridge can be hard to reconcile. And there's been obviously other challenges, which is how do you communicate about climate change and sustainability to those around you so that they start to understand as well, right? Because you really feel like you're making a difference when people around you start to adopt these things as well. And you can see that it's the easiest way to make change is by convincing the people around you to follow the same sustainable path. But having how to have that kind of discourse and how to convince people and change mindsets has also been a key challenge.
Wow. That's great. Other thoughts or comments? Melissa, Melissa.
Yeah, I'm happy to follow Latika. I probably share an experience that I've had, which I still think about very often. When I finished when I completed my first master's, my then supervisor told me that, maybe a PhD is not for you. And this was in 2013. PhD maybe not for you because you want to start a family. And I decided to actually do another master's degree because of that comment. I maybe thought I wasn't ready. And this is also why I only just started my PhD studies last year. So I would just say that there may be people who don't understand or who still practice a certain way of thinking. And these are some challenges that anybody, not just women, will have to face in this line of work, right? Not just in climate advocacy or action, but in academia in general, right? So just focus on what you need to do. Don't let what other people say get you down. That's so cliche, but like the challenges are going to be coming at you at all times in all forms. Right, so it's not just about people undermining you, saying that, oh, you don't have a PhD, how can you be researching on climate change? It's people asking what are your underlying motivations to attending the climate negotiations? Are you going to be undermining the Singapore delegation position as an observer, as an NGO? These are comments you cannot control. Right, it's completely outside of your own actions. So the best you can do is literally to ignore, just do what you do and do it well, and show people that you're committed to this cause and prove them wrong. Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. Any other thoughts from Ben or RJ? No.
Yep.
Yes, Professor Kasha. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is this how to avoid what we refer to as the policy tool creation euphoria that's characterized climate governance over the last 30 years, whatever the mechanism happens to be. The latest great idea, right? And then the following implementation depression cycle, when things don't go as well as planned, and you get this upward excitement and then downward depression, and then a new idea emerges, a policy tool idea emerges, and you get excited again. You know, it's now like Copenhagen was exciting, then Paris exciting, now not Paris, right? How do we then think about maintaining the euphoria, but not the depression cycle, right? To me, I think the youth can play a really important role in there, again, linking ideas around specific things to actual on the ground performance. And you know, we all work on this conversation, and my point is, let's really roll up our sleeves and do this well to avoid the depression part of that cycle.
Thank you, Professor Kaushal. I think the point is extremely well taken, right? So it's really about the sustainability of the efforts, you know, pun not intended. Yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So on that note, so with regard to policy making, so there are a couple of questions pertaining to the government's efforts and how to communicate with the government. So let me verbalize a couple of these questions. Right. Okay. So so there was a question about how the green movement and climate change actions are being communicated to the Singapore government, and is there any dialogue session with the ministry? And also relatedly, there is also a question of what you hope to see more of our government doing, and besides, well, perhaps like being bolder or something else, right? So these questions pertain to government action and what is done to communicate some of these efforts to the government. So any thoughts or takers? Melissa,
I think that the government is listening. I can see it for sure. As I mentioned in my earlier remarks, there was a very interesting feedback session that was done on the long-term low emissions development strategy. This must have been 2 years ago now, actually. Time is just all relative. So what happened with that particular feedback session was that it was email based. So I think it matters as to how feedback is done, right? So this is via the online REACH portal. For those of you who are not Singaporean, REACH is the Singapore government's feedback unit, feedback arm. So the ministries or agencies can actually upload a document or a survey, and they design the survey, right, to be able to receive certain feedback in certain forms. So the National Climate Change Secretary actually organized that particular one that I'm mentioning, and it was email based. And when I first read it, I thought the barrier to entry was extremely high, because some young people may not know, not just young people, any people who might find it challenging to craft an email, could find it challenging to respond to the feedback, to the requirement. But I was so heartened when this group called Speak for Climate and WWF organized templates. And templates are a really great form of advocacy because it lowers the barriers so much. And in the end, the NCCS, number one, they extended the feedback by a month because there was just so much feedback coming in. And number two, they received over 2,000 feedback emails. Okay, many of them were templates, sure, but like still the quantum matters because they usually only get up to 1,000. And third, they actually asked people who submitted feedback for permission to publish the feedback. And you can see the feedback on REACH or on their NCCS website. This is, in the 10 years that I've been in this space, I've never seen this at all. So I struggled, with this. I struggled because I submitted a fairly critical feedback. I struggled thinking like, oh no, should I publish? It's accountability for me too, right? So I actually put like a bunch of disclaimers saying this is my personal view, blah, blah, blah. So that's important, right? So I see the process evolving. And I think as people who are interested in climate action, in advocacy, do look at how people have been doing this, right? So there's this great book I would encourage everybody to read. I think it's published by Ethos. It's called The Art of Hypocrisy. And it actually details the history of advocacy in Singapore. And you can learn from these processes, learn from these different NGOs and the causes, and actually how they've used certain tools to actually engage the government. So don't just learn from the environmental advocates. Some things work, some things don't. And maybe we can borrow from the women's group, maybe we can borrow from the nature groups as well, you know, like, because they all have employed various tools over the years. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. Anyone else, in particular, you know, with regard to the question of what you would like to see the government doing specifically? You know, perhaps like something more or something. Or, yes, Ben.
Just quickly, I mean, yeah, I agree. I mean, the vast majority of the world governments have agreed to try and achieve the 1.5 degree Paris Accord target. So it's no longer a question of debating that policy objective. It's now a question of how do we actually help governments and the private sector achieve that policy target. And so for me, there's actually lots of things governments are doing already. I think they're quite excited about this right now in this space. There are literally thousands of policy levers out there, including what's happened with these solar panel efforts called the feed-in tariff programs that began in Germany. Now there are over 160 jurisdictions all over the world that link economic incentives with low carbon economies, with norms around low carbon behaviors that are around these policy baskets that are really innovative and exciting stuff. And there are thousands of examples like that the governments want to learn more about and try and design effectively. A huge space to link, again, youth around policy design to achieve these transformations. It's a very exciting time, I agree.
Thanks, Professor Kashio. Yeah, so we move on to another question based on another topic, which I thought is very interesting. Right, so everyone, how do you see the role of arts and social media in climate advocacy? Right, so changing social habits, pushing for more systemic changes, whether it's the government corporations across the ASEAN region. So the question here pertains to the role of the arts and social media. Right, any thoughts or comments from the panelists? Yes, RJ, please.
Thank you so much for that question. I believe it's Chunyu who asked that question. Yeah, I think, oh, okay. I believe that the arts has an important role to play in kind of spreading awareness about these issues. And often this is the case because a message conveyed through an artistic medium is much more of an emotional one. And sometimes that is what is needed to really get people on the ground to engage with the issue beyond reciting the numbers and the catastrophic impacts. Having an emotional connection to the issue of the climate crisis is something that's very powerful. And it's something that has also influenced me in some ways in getting involved in this issue. As for social media, I think that there's a significant role to play in allowing people to communicate with each other across different areas, different spaces. But I think, and to build on something that Melissa mentioned as well, there's a lot that environmental activists can learn, advocates can learn from advocates that have gone before on how to bridge beyond social media to really effect changes in public perception and government policy on the ground. And often this comes from having physical, obviously not now, but physical in-person conversations with people to persuade them and convince them, something that I think a lot of previous advocates and in ages past before social media have done well, and something definitely that environmental advocates can learn from.
Thanks, RJ. Any other thoughts from anyone else? Okay. Okay, so I see that we have a few minutes left. Okay, so let us take a very quick question from another one of our members of the audience. So Ryan asked, what are your thoughts on the green sustainable startup scene in Singapore? Right, so this is actually very specific to the startup scene in Singapore. Right, so any thoughts on these question? Anyone?
Yeah, maybe I can chime in here. Yeah, I think Singapore definitely has one of the largest ecosystems when it comes to sustainability startups. And I think that in my view, that is personally because, Singapore has done a great job of creating these kind of financial levers. There's a lot of investors based here. To a certain extent, the dialogue on climate change and sustainability is a bit more advanced than in the other markets in Asia or in ASEAN, for instance. I think the issue with sustainability startups in Singapore, though, is that the market here itself is limited. You know, Singapore being a smaller country, for most startups to gain that kind of commercial maturity, they have to look outside of Singapore. And that's where it gets a bit harder to sell your product, right? Because that means that you have to go into a country that has that same level of climate dialogue. You need to be able to navigate the regulations there, depending on the kind of products or services you provide and so on. So I think there is a lot of potential, and the government is, you know, obviously heavily looking at giving boost to sustainability startups and helping them go abroad as well. But that challenge of you're based here, but your market is outside is something that a lot of startups struggle with in the sustainability space.
Thank you, Latika. So on that note, I would like to, in the remaining 2 minutes, I'll actually like to return to the very first question that was posted in the chat window, right? So I'm sure that many of you students, you know, have actually been inspired, you know, by our 4 panelists this morning. So this question is for all the speakers. So could you share some avenues which students, like most of us, right, the audience here, can approach or make a difference or change, right? So what concrete actions, you know, can students and our youth take today, and what are some of the tools and opportunities that exist to do that? Yeah. Any thoughts on this question?
I would just
Melissa.
say, I would encourage students, I mean, first of all, not to see yourselves as just students or just youth, right? I mean, your voice is as important as anybody else's, right? And so just read widely, sit with your thoughts first, and then figure out what you want to say, develop a position, and realize that it's fine to have a differing opinion from other people. I think in this world of social media, which I didn't jump on that question earlier, but it's easy to take polarizing views, right? But I think it's completely acceptable to have differing opinions, and that's what makes society and interesting, right? So it's fine. We should just accept that we can agree to disagree, as they say. And if your view differs from someone else, why not ask that someone else why their views, what they've been motivated by, and why they've taken those views, right? There's no point arguing and you know, being upset. I mean, it's fine to be upset, and that motivates people too, right? But my sense is that do not let that be a barrier to action. That's my point. You know, so go read up and figure out what cause within the environmental sphere and within the climate action sphere you want to champion, because this issue is so wide-ranging that you really need to focus. Otherwise, you also get lost in everything. And reach out to people like ourselves. You know, I'm happy to continue to be in touch with folks who need a little bit of help and who need somebody to speak to. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. Any other final words from the rest of our panelists? Anyone? Yes, RJ, please.
Yeah, I suppose I can share, being a current student myself, facing the day-to-day grind of student life. I think that oftentimes it's very difficult for us to see how we can play an impact, given that we are, given that we are not working, or we're not, you know, in a company that can change things. And also that a lot of the messaging that we get hit by is to do things that seem insignificant, be it like plastic straws reduction, and people consider that, you know, as an individual, I can't do much. And so that's why I believe that as students, one of the greater impacts that we have is as youth who are going to be affected by climate change, arguably the most, and we'll have to live with it the longest by definition almost. That gives us moral authority to speak on these issues, that gives us moral authority to write in to our local representatives, be the members of parliament or other representatives, to ask about what is being done on these issues. And I think that there are many organizations now that are trying to mobilize in this direction. Some of them are helping out students. And of course, one of them is SG Climate Rally. And if there's any interest that people have in how they can contribute, you can write into our email address or send a message on our website. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ajay. So I think on that very positive note, let's thank all our panelists this morning for their wonderful sharing and most inspiring comments. Yeah. So I'm sorry that we can't get to all of your comments, but I can see that there is actually quite a bit of exchange in the chat window as well. We'll try to get to as many of the remaining questions as possible, like offline after the session, right? So with that, let's thank our panelists again, and I'm going to pass the floor back to Jared.
Thanks, Prof. Leonard. Thank you to all the speakers who took the time to get involved in the insightful discussion. So as Prof. Cole mentioned earlier, we actually launched the data visualization competition earlier this year. And the point of the competition was for teams to come up with creative and innovative ways to communicate data and risk information creatively. So the proposals were not only unique, but they also conveyed risk information in a way that we felt were worthy of winning the competition. So allow us to officially congratulate teams and to present you this video that we prepared for this workshop.
Our team believes that when crafting environmental policies, there needs to be a balance between saving the environment and ensuring human civilization's ability to function. This is something we want to demonstrate in our project.
So our proposal concept is to create an interactive display that links policy decisions to climate change outcomes. In this display, users choose between actions and can judge their effects on the climate. In particular, we chose to make it interactive so that the user feels a sense of ownership both over the decision-making process as well as the displayed outcome. We hope that at the end, the user can agree that climate change is important, relevant, and should be addressed right away.
Our product will take on the form of an engaging and interactive quiz, which consists of various everyday life scenarios. For example, the question could be, how would you get to work? And the options are, take a Grab, take your car, or take public transport. With each answer, intuitive data visualization diagrams will be presented, such that participants can effortlessly understand their impacts. Suggestions will then be provided for them to minimize their carbon footprints. With this quiz, we aim to raise awareness on the severity of climate change, which is a slow burn issue that many people may neglect since it is a very gradual process. Our product will challenge the perceived mild risk of climate change and highlight the actual risk and severity of climate change. Lastly, we also hope to encourage behavior to the fight against climate change through our suggestions.
With our proposal, we aim to create a fun, interactive article to inform individuals an accurate overview of climate risk in Asia. So our objective is to construct a personally relatable, yet accurate, interactive article that readers can get to play around with different parameters such as the country of origin, year, and what kind of side effects they can feel from the decisions that they choose. So the key message is to showcase the extent of risk of climate change with respect to their individual lives.
We were drawn to the idea of using data visualization as a means to communicate risk. So that was another reason why we thought Optigram was a good chance for us to learn both about climate change as well as how to use a particular method of communicating risk.
The idea for my proposal is to represent the death from causes related to climate change in the form of a mandala picture. So a mandala is the drawing of a very intricate flower shape, and it can consist of many dots and lines. For my proposal specifically, I would be using only dots, and each dot would be representing a casualty from a cause related to climate change. I hope that from visualizing the number of casualties that are related to climate change, the audience would be more able to internalize the problems a little bit more, understand that climate change is a real thing and it does relate to more
deaths that are not, that shouldn't have happened in the first place, and encourage people to take more actions.
So thank you once again to, and congratulations to our winners of Optigram, the data visualization competition that we launched earlier this year. Just to touch on one thing that Prof. Leonard mentioned during the panel discussion, as there were questions that weren't addressed or had time to be answered by the speakers, we will be compiling the questions and trying to get some responses from our speakers. And we will look to follow up with everybody here via email sometime next week or soon after the workshop. So as we're about to close the workshop, I'd just like to take the time to actually invite our director again, Prof. Koh, to tell us more about the launch. I'm sorry, actually, there is one other thing. I forgot that I'd like to welcome actually Dr. Oliver Jensen, our lead scientist for environment and climate, to present to us some of the existing works of the Institute. Dr. Jensen, please.
Cool, Jared, thank you for the introduction and very much for this opportunity. So you had a little from Prof. Koh, and you saw there in action our Optigram competition. So these are parts of our outreach and engagement activities, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the research that we're doing as well. And because many of you, in fact, have already been involved in this research in different capacities, in sharing your knowledge and in participating in interviews. So this is the perfect opportunity for me to express my thanks and hope that we can continue to engage on these topics. Jared, could I share the slides at this stage?
Yeah, Olivia, yes, please go ahead.
I think I can't screen share. So I'll just, maybe you could put up the slides and I'll just, I can just talk over them. No problem. I wanted to talk about 4 projects which we've been working on, just to highlight some of the different kinds of activities that we do, and to talk specifically about some Singapore projects and as well as those that link to the global agenda. So the first one is a project that we did, which is emblematic of the collaborative nature of our research. So it was a collaboration with the Centre for Livable Cities, which is under the MND, but it's also a collaboration with a particular community within Singapore, which is the around Cambridge Road, which is near Farrer Park. And the question that we were trying to look into there was, what is it that makes a community resilient, and how can we measure that? Now, a lot of the measures for local level resilience are centered around infrastructure, or perhaps around emergency response and warning systems. But what we found in talking to people, so let's just move to that previous picture, if we may, Jared, this one. So in the course of the research, we were doing focus groups, and we also did these community walkabouts. So we were talking to people not just about their experiences of resilience, but also seeing where they were having those experiences. And here's one particularly engaged member of the community explaining about this flood marker. So this area used to experience a lot of floods, and he's letting his other local residents know about what it was and why it was important. And what we found, sort of in addition to some of the kinds of indicators that we might use, is that social capital seemed to be very important to the resilience of the community. So the networks of connections between neighbors and between local organizations, as well as the role of particular individuals, champions, who for one reason or another feel motivated to take on environmental issues, and then to make it their job to talk to the other residents about it, to let them know about the risks, and also to engage them in helping in things like building community gardens, in running the community fridge, and so on. And this issue of champions, how they emerge, what we can do to support them, and how we can help them to be successful in their aims is one of the things that we're going to be doing in our research program going forward. The next slide, please, Jack. The next project that I'd like to talk about a little bit is on climate risk communications by experts. This is a collaboration with Professor Louis Lebel at Chiang Mai University. Some of you might have seen the seminar that he gave last week on this project. Our question here was really, well, we know quite a lot. We know there's a lot of academic research about communicating climate change. There are lots of experiments, there are surveys. We know lots about when it seems to work best to try to trigger people's emotions, when it works best to give people more information, and how that then affects both their attitudes and their intentions to act in particular ways. But is there a gap between that academic research and the people who are out there? Actually, it's quite a lot of you who are on a daily basis communicating about climate risks. So it could be activists and advocates, journalists, but also people like weathercasters who could, given the right information and support, be actively engaged in communicating climate risks. Next slide, please. So for this project, we took a really wide view of who experts are. And we, through that process, I think, learned a lot about how many people are working, constructing for themselves, in fact, hybrid roles in between research and communication. Some of them are making it up really as they go along, as they run into challenges and working out how to do it better. And our feeling again is that there might be more that we could do to support those people, to show them experiences from others and from other bits of the world, and as Melissa and others mentioned, from other issue areas, to help them, not have to climb the entire learning curve, but to go in using all the tools and the knowledge that we already have available about how to communicate climate risks effectively. The next slide and the next project is a very Singapore-specific one. And here we were collaborating with PUB, the National Water Agency, to get a better understanding of how people, the general public, as well as experts, perceive a sea level rise risk. So PUB became responsible for Singapore's coastal protection just a couple of years ago. And since then, they've been engaging and trying to understand, both from an engineering and a technical point of view, how to protect Singapore, as well as how to engage people. Now, one of the really striking things from this project was that people have a very good understanding of sea level rise risks. We found a vast majority of people were aware of those risks. The next slide, please, Jack. And you might have seen these advertisements, this publicity campaign, which was launched by PUB just a couple of months ago, back in March, which had these very dramatic pictures of a huge wave crashing over a family at the beach. And then on the right-hand side, this very optimistic, almost magical seawall, which would protect Singapore from sea level rise risk. But an important thing, which we also found out through the project, is that people don't know what the government is doing. There's a sense that the government is taking care of this, but in terms of detailed actions, what a seawall is and looks like, how it's going to affect them and the places where they go for recreation, people don't have a clear idea. And they also don't have a clear idea of what they can do. So there's a kind of caretaker effect in which people say, well, sea level rise risk is a problem, but the government's done an amazing job on flooding in the past, and so they'll do a good job on sea level rise as well. What's the role for me in this? But there is a role. There's an important role in engaging in consultations, in trying to design infrastructure that meets multiple purposes, not just a kind of ugly wall that keeps the sea out, but ways in which nature-based solutions can be integrated and recreation areas can be integrated with this coastal protection infrastructure. And that needs inputs and ideas from people. The other thing we found is this big gap between what the kinds of actions that people know about and think they can take on climate change, and the stuff that might really make a difference. And I think Ajay pointed to this, that these small actions like taking recyclable bags to the supermarket, or turning up the air conditioning to a higher temperature. But many of the most important actions are ones in the public space. Engaging with your neighbors and your friends, especially the ones who don't necessarily already agree with you, engaging with policymakers, engaging with government representatives. And so we see that as another gap in which the Institute should be working actively to think about ways to communicate to people how they can take these kinds of public actions in addition to those private actions. Next slide, please, Darren. Finally, I want to connect this up to the global level and talk about some research. This is a quantitative analysis that we're doing using the results of the World Risk Poll. So the World Risk Poll was a massive global survey of 150,000 people in 140 countries. And it has several questions, not in great detail, but several questions about people's perception of climate risks. Again, there was a large majority of people perceived the risk, but a minority of people either hadn't heard of climate change or didn't feel they were able to respond to the question. That was about 20% of people around the world. And there's another chunk of people, let's say somewhere between 15 and 20%, depending on which country, who said they weren't concerned. And on the next slide, you can see some of these countries which have the highest proportion of people who said they didn't think climate risk was a problem for people in their country in the next 20 years. Can we have a look at that map, Joan? And just keep clicking until all the info comes up. Thanks very much. So these are 10 countries around the world which have the lowest perceptions of climate risks. It's an eclectic grouping. And I think it points to the extent of the challenge that we have ahead of us. So even if nationally in Singapore, people have an excellent understanding of the presence of climate risks, there are places around the world which are going to be impacted very severely. Look at this: Iraq, Libya, Egypt, the Gulf states, Ethiopia, Myanmar. These are countries in which there are vulnerable people who are going to be very severely impacted by rising temperatures, as well as potentially by sea level rise, but in particular by heat and drought. And it's those countries where we're getting large proportions of people saying they're not concerned. So what do we do as researchers, advocates, and activists to engage with people in these countries, in these pretty tough, challenging communication situations, as well as at home? That's the end of the slide. I'll just round off with a couple of comments. So Melissa highlighted this challenge. We've got, as researchers, are we asking the right questions? Are we pushing the boundary? And at the same time, are we doing something that's helpful to support people who are trying to communicate about climate risks in order to do their job better, to meet their goals? And I would like to extend an invitation to all our participants today in the seminar to let us know what they think the research questions are. And I would also like to ask you, again, I'm certain that I'm going to be reaching out to some of you in the future, if not all of you, and I would really like to continue these conversations. As Ben said, we need to work cumulatively. We want to accelerate and to keep up that euphoria. So by having a good understanding of what each of us is working on and where our skills lie, we can help to accelerate that process, I think. So thanks, Jared, back to you.
Thanks, Olivia. We're coming to the end of the workshop, but before we do, I'd like to once again invite Prof. Cole to tell us more about the launch of a Climate Action Fund initiative by the Institute, as well as to give his closing remarks for the workshop. Prof. Cole, please.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Thanks to Olivia for providing a quick review on our Institute works on environment and climate. You can contact us if you are interested to know more details or to do collaboration with us. As part of our climate risk campaign, we have recently started the Climate Action Fund. Janet, do you have a slide on that? Right? Yeah. Climate Action Fund, which is officially launched today. So this fundraising campaign is to support our research and outreach efforts, particularly in devising effective strategies to help people understand a wide range of issues that we talk about, related to climate change, and also, more and more people to become climate advocates and even climate warriors. So as you, yeah, all right. So yeah, I can see the slide now. Yeah. So as you heard earlier from our panelist, Latika, that there are two things we can control: our time and our money, right? So besides spending time doing something for climate action in one way or another, you can make contribution with your money, and no amount is too small. So we hope you can support our climate action fund by, there's a QR code on the screen, or you go to the link provided in the chat box. I believe Jared will do that in a short while, or maybe already have done. Or just simply visit our website for more information about our climate action fund. Yeah, so we have come to the end of this workshop. And thank you so much for your participation, and special thanks go to our invited speakers. I believe their insights and personal journeys will help in shaping our individual and joint actions to take on climate change. And to all the participants, I believe you have also benefited from this workshop, and look forward to your support of our future events. And we'll follow up with you, as Jared said, by email, and we'll have some summary of the key takeaways from this workshop, as well as some of the existing works that could be of interest to you. So once again, thank you very much for your participation, and have a good weekend ahead. Thank you.